First and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out today. And for those who are into that kind of thing, today is Pi Day. Anybody know about the number pi? All right, there we go. 314. So, by way of just saying thanks to everyone, and thank you for the wonderful introductions you all and to the president of the school. Hello. My name's Paul Miller, and I'm a writer, artist, and musician, and I just came here from South by Southwest, which is always entertaining just for the sheer volume of traffic. It's, you just realize the cities are not made for that volume of people. All right, so what I want to do today is unpack a couple of issues relating to my new book with MIT Press, which I've kind of looking at the idea of how apps have changed the creative process. But I've written multiple books, usually in collaboration with MIT. So by way of getting started, let me just ask everybody in the room, how many of y'all have a phone, just out of curiosity? Okay, that's about 100%. And then of that 100%, how many of you have an Android phone? Okay, that's a good amount of geeks, all right. And then how many of you have an Apple phone, iOS? Okay, so that's about 80%. So what we were just doing there is looking at this idea of network systems, and cell phones are now one of the basic windows into what we think of as the web. So let's unpack that from the viewpoint of my book. So a little while ago, I wrote a book called The Imaginary App, and I was looking at how multimedia and network systems change the creative process. When you think about art, technology, and above all literature, you're thinking about codes, whether it be a code of literature as it unfolds in a novel, of storytelling, of poetry, but above all, the kind of slide you're seeing behind me is about sort of the collision between code and culture. So with arts, and generally, we are left with a situation where we've had centuries and centuries of people making objects, paintings, sculptures, and so on, that are fixed, they're done. Like when Picasso finishes a painting, or when Wagner finishes a symphony, those are considered fixed works. That people play them over and over for centuries. Bach's, Goldberg variations, you name it. But in our era, we're in the era of the remix, where you can open that file up and change it again and again and again. And if you put it online, somebody's going to take it and run with it. They'll get a mashup of, you got Wu-Tang Clan, you got whatever. Everybody is going to mess with something once it's online. So that kind of thing points to this idea of an unstable object, an object made of collage, of bits and pieces. So let's go back in time a little bit. My book is inspired by some of these folks. This is the Italian Futurists. In 1915, this was Luigi Russolo on the left. Basically what ended up happening is he created a situation where he called intono rumore, and he wanted to create sound coming out of these kind of speakers. And at the time it was very controversial. Everyone would riot and they'd start throwing bottles at him and say, "Where's the band?" And he said, "In the music of the future will all be coming out of these kind of speakers." And in 1915, look around you can see who won. So the whole point here is this is one of the first sound systems. And the whole idea of a sound system is to kind of create a situation where sound is coming out of amplified material, and you're actually not experiencing the quote-unquote authentic band or a person or anything. You're hearing something that's essentially displaced in experience coming out of the speakers around us. So what I wanted to do with that was unpack that from the viewpoint of apps. So an app essentially is a tool that lets you think about code as kind of a way of envisioning different approaches to how you would organize that code into a tool. So for example, when I began the book, I tracked down this. This is Armin Heinrich. He made an app called I Am Rich. We begin the book with this one. It's really funny. And so this is one of the most expensive apps on iTunes, and it was $999.99, and it didn't do anything. So he wanted to just show that, so people started downloading it just to show they were rich. So like Russian oligarchs, Saudi princes, probably some oil barons here in Texas. So if you saw on their phone that they had this little red thing, it was just meant to show that you were a conspicuous consumer, someone. So Apple, this is about, don't forget, it's 2008. So the iPhone has been out 10 years. All you in the room, your phone is over 10 years of technology research. But Android came out a little bit before that. But above all, this app was the first spoof app. It was an art app. And I thought that was really interesting because it was a sense of humor and wit made into code. So when I was working on the book, one of the things that we ended up doing was also creating an exhibition where I had a whole bunch of artists. We did an open source call, and we had artists come up with app covers for apps that didn't exist. And so that's why the book's called The Imaginary App. So if you went to the exhibition, you'd start seeing bits and pieces of projects, and above all, of places and situations that didn't exist. So I wanted to say, well, it's an imaginary app, let's do it. So if you went there, you'd walk into a room, and you'd see all sorts of different apps that basically were taking you into a place of fiction. And from my own point of view, it was like saying that art and graphic design, and above all, the way apps change the creative process, they all are related, and nothing is separate, and that's part of our 21st century scenario. So, I'm inspired for the book a little bit from the term Richard Wagner came up with, where he essentially says imagination creates reality. Wagner coined the term Gesamtkunstwerk in German, which basically means total artwork. So, going from 1915 to what I showed you guys with the Italian Futurists to 2019, we've had over 100 years of looking at how technology shapes not only culture as it unfolds with technology, but the way codes underlie most of that. So we're now in what one could argue is what you're calling algorithmic realism. When I say algorithm, that's a term for what the patterns that are mathematically generated that make your phones work, that make the web work, and so on. So when I first asked you guys who knew about the today was Pi Day, I also wanted to bring up one other kind of fun fact, which is yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the internet. And the first, not the internet, the web, sorry, I want to make sure to clarify that. And the web as we know it was done based on basically a war of encryption that comes out of World War II. This is Alan Turing, and here he has a device called the Enigma device. And this is a 3D volumetric print of Alan Turing taken from a photograph. So during World War II, the Allies were in the middle of a war with the Germans, not just based on how planes were flying and bombs were flying, but actually code. So the Germans were very far ahead in terms of mathematics, and the Allies needed to crack their codes to be able to hear what they were doing. So Turing had to come up with a device to break the Germans. Code was considered unbreakable at that time with the mathematics at that time. So he invented the modern computer as we know it to be able to crunch all the numbers the Germans were using to make their codes. So generally he's considered the father of computing. So he coined the term biomorphogenesis to start thinking about the way codes influence all aspects of contemporary life, whether it be mathematics, the everyday life that we live, or mathematics run through computational processes. So generally, he's considered to be a really brilliant mathematician. So when he came with the term biomorphosis, he was thinking about micro versus macro patterns. So say, for example, I'm using the slide of the galaxy because most of us know this image, but you can also see the same thing in, say, for example, this. This is a storm that probably just came through here a little while ago, but we can also see the same pattern here. So with human beings, we're always looking for patterns in nature, and patterns define the way that human beings kind of interact with the world around us. We're pattern-seeking creatures. Now, biologically speaking and mathematically speaking, that's where Alan Turing coined the term biomorphogenesis. So once you get the pattern of something, you can have a mathematical portrait of it. So with the book, what I ended up doing was looking for different projects that I thought enhanced that and showed it from the viewpoint of the arts. So with the exhibition, everyone who came up with an app cover for an app that didn't exist, we presented it as a collective thing. And if you start thinking about how many apps are being made every day that are on your phone or your tablets, you can actually start realizing that, especially with the book that we were working on it, graphics and the way we think about graphics influence all aspects of modern life. So, one other book I wrote before that one was called Sound Unbound. And basically I was really interested in looking at how sound and the arts intersect as well. So, let's look at this. This is the first record cover sleeve from the 1920s. And basically, it's a collage. You can see the vinyl grooves. You can also see a marquee from Times Square. and it was done for Columbia Records. So we tracked down the gentleman who invented the record cover sleeve, and his name's Alex Steinweiss. In the 1920s, record covers were blank. And you got to imagine, it was just basically you go to a record store and you ask them to play the record. So he had a great idea. He said, why don't we put an image on the record cover sleeve to give you guys an idea of what the actual music sounds like. So put an image to give you an idea of what the sound is. So that became a highly influential concept, and the record cover sleeve was born. Now, if you think about the 20th century and graphic design, you can actually, everyone who has an iPhone, you gotta remember Steve Jobs, when he launched the iPhone in 2008, was thinking about the same thing. Apple is named after the Beatles record label, Apple Records, and there was actually a lot of lawsuits between the Beatles and Apple. But he also was really interested in giving people tools, apps, that would give them a sensibility of whatever their tool was doing. So you can go from these record cover sleeves to this. And you start realizing that the graphic design of the way our contemporary life is going through phones and tablets and so on, it all still goes back to some of these earlier analog methods of creating imagery to come out of code. So when I was working on the Imaginary app, I was really interested in getting people to realize that code and culture are not mutually exclusive. And when you start thinking about graphics and apps, that's something that I think everyone in the room probably, anyone who uses a phone, whether it be Google Maps or so on. So when we had the exhibition, that was a foundation, but it was also a connection to show that the book is an exhibition, a project, and a digital media initiative. It's connected, it's interdisciplinary. So we even tracked down the gentleman who invented Google Maps. His name is Gordon Moore. I'll show you that really quickly. Basically what ended up happening is Google Maps is probably one of the most used apps in the world. Here's Apple Maps. I don't know if anybody remembers this one. But when I was working on the book, the Imaginary app, I wanted to show what happens when you have less data. And basically, when Apple released Apple Maps, it wasn't working so great because they didn't have enough data, and the actual algorithms were crunching the streets. Anybody remember this one? Yeah. So if you try driving on this road, good luck. So we tracked down the gentleman who invented Google Maps, and I did an interview with him for the book. And I visited him at Google, and he was like, we invented Google Maps, and I'll just show you really quickly what that looks like. All right, so it was pretty interesting. 1 second here. And so there's a whole sensibility of how. 1 second here. I want to make sure to show you guys. It's the early whiteboard. All right. So, and basically, Noel Gordon is the inventor. Sorry, I glitched on his name there for a second. But when he was working on Google Maps, what they did was they drew a series of equations, and I'll just show you that really quickly, getting basically from A to B. And when they were working on Google Maps, they really realized that so much of the way we navigate landscapes is about the way those equations shape and optimize our routes. So for example, Waze, if anybody's a driver, Waze has a different way of getting you past like a police like speed bump checks and stuff like that, and so on and so on. But when they were working on it, they had to come up with a series of algorithms and equations that still to this day are basically how anyone who uses Google Maps, and that's probably the most used app in the world. So when I visited him, it was really interesting because he was able to show me some of their early projects, and it was pretty amazing to be able to see how that would unfold. But at the same time, like when you're in a real world context, you still have to remember that it's also the 30th anniversary of the web. So 2019, 1989 to 2019, this is Sir Tim Berners-Lee. He invented the web as we know it. In 1989, basically he was at CERN in Switzerland and wrote a series of equations that came up with what he called the semantic web. And for me as an artist, it's really fascinating because his equations versus the equations for Google Maps, they're not necessarily super different in terms of just thinking about optimizing routes and how information moves on the landscape. When I say landscape, I'm talking about a data landscape, for example. So let's unpack this. Here you have Google Maps allowing you to navigate in the real world, and here you have Sir Tim Berners-Lee with some of the earliest equations defining the web. So that's called HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, HTML. For me at least, it was really fascinating because one superimposes over the other. Like you read a map and you move through it versus the web itself is now a kind of huge data map of all of these people putting up websites and exchanging information, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and so on. So generally, by the way, yesterday was literally the 30th anniversary of the internet, so I'm sorry, the web. I'll show you really quickly. So he put out a manifesto the other day, and this is just yesterday, so it's pretty fresh. And so he's now doing this whole thing about we need to rethink about this Web 2.0. And so I was at South by Southwest yesterday, and it was pretty fascinating to get a chance to catch up with a lot of people in the digital media art scene. And so I met Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and we also have done a conversation about the web. I even gave him a hip-hop hat. I just kind of thought it would be kind of fun there. And so the way I think about art, science, technology, and literature is that there's an interdisciplinary and hyper-collage-based world. And that informs my ideas around the imaginary app. So, I also produce apps, and just want to show you really quickly. One of the apps I've made is called DJ Mixer Pro, and my performer name is DJ Spooky, so we did a premium version, and that's this one. So when you open it up, basically it's two virtual turntables, and it lets you pull anything from SoundCloud, Google Music, Spotify, iTunes, and so on. So you have access to millions of songs. So for example, if I'm just going to show you guys a quick remix here. So what I'm doing is kind of make the software automatically detects edit points. You see those yellow lines really quick. So it's pretty addictive, I'll leave it at that. So basically I was coming up with tools that let people DJ from their phone or their iPad. And I was really interested in that, working with software coders. And we were the first DJ app on iTunes. We've had over 12 million downloads. You can see we're in the top, usually in the top 5 on iTunes in terms of downloads. But I got into a little bit of a legal dispute with my developers, so we pulled the app down at the moment. So when I was working on the book, I wanted to show as much as possible how artists can really rethink the creative process with new tools. So software for me is a tool that is very much part of the process. But on the other end of the spectrum, so for example, this is a concert where you can see I'm DJing software here and sampling a string ensemble live and mixing with hip hop and electronic music to give you a sense of that, how that would be. When you work on a book, you're thinking about specifically how someone's going to be turning page to page. And several of my projects are based mostly on how environmental issues and code collide as well. So one project, recently I went to Antarctica and did a project where I was making electronic music out of the sound of ice. And I carried a backpack and went into several of the main ice fields of Antarctica for several weeks and wrote a series of music compositions. There's also, these are all projects that show art and science and how climate change is based on how people use data. So with that said and done, I know that we're on a little bit of a tight time frame, but I want to give you guys a sense of, say for example, you guys are getting an art mix. This is me normally DJ. We have about 10,000 people front row. And all these girls are throwing their bras on stage. I mean, it's definitely not today. So you guys are getting the art mix. That's the party mix. But when I'm DJing, I'm usually thinking about software and design and the way that that can affect how the concert unfolds. So, for example, the software I made lets you control visuals. You can also control the screens while you're DJing, and then be able to call up files from, like I said earlier, iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Music, Spotify, and so on. So, with that said and done, what I wanted to do today was just open that up from the viewpoint of the literary approach. But, for example, when I was working on my Antarctica project, we had this premiere at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I'll just show you what that would look like, just to give you a sense of how that would work. When I do my concerts, they're based on software design. And so, for example, this is the show. You can see we had a sold-out audience, a little bit under 1,000 people, but I'd taken all sorts of electronic music and made it become different kinds of ice. Now, for example, how would that work? So, I wrote a book, and the book is called The Book of Ice, and Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government. But we had this premiere at Sundance. It was hosted by a very renowned actor, Robert Redford. So when you went in the room, we had loops made like from electronic music that would make the sound of water into different kinds of beats. So hip hop, techno, dubstep, and so on. And so whenever you see a piece of ice, again, I was talking earlier about code, right? So you actually see a hexagonal form, but if you take the mathematics of that, you can easily see that you're seeing the same thing. It's a hexagonal shape over and over, and you just fold it against itself, and you still, mathematically speaking, are having the same equation. So what I did was take that equation and start to think about how to make music out of that. So this is the science, and we worked with a group of data scientists to come up with this, but also look at hip hop. And so, for example, this is Iceberg Slim. He was a gentleman who would take photographs of himself on top of huge piles of ice. And you can see he has an old school Jerry curl. Just don't do it. It's very 80s. So that he would have the nickname, and you got to remember in hip hop, black culture, they call themselves Ice because it's cool, it's cold, and basically you would have someone like Ice Cube, Ice T. You got the white guy, you got Vanilla Ice, and so everybody started naming themselves Ice. So that was kind of a pun here. So you got the hip hop poetic, but you also got the scientific. So what I do when I'm working my books is I also do graphics because I'm an artist. So we made a book, we put it up on Apple, iTunes, and did a series of graphic design prints that are playable by string quartet. So it's a classical music meets hip hop project, but also all the music is derived from electronic music based on the climate data. So I do the graphics for my books. These are some of my prints that were at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And like I said, I made Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government, so that's copyright free. So we made an album as well, so it's called Of Water and Ice. So you might be wondering, how does that sound and how does that become a book? So let's think about literature for a second. And if you hear the term phonograph, let me show you that again. You're hearing two words, phonetics and graphology, writing with sound. So with hip hop, most people are rapping or creating poetry. But for me, I make electronic music, and I'm not rapping, but I'm actually making the beats. So what I'll do is I'll sample and loop stuff. I'll just show you really quick. This is, say for example, NWA, and one of the most sampled beats of the 90s is called Amen. And you'll hear, I'll do why I'm doing this in a second, just really quick.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
So all Dr. Dre did was take the same beat from this track and just slow it down. So basically Dr. Dre was really good at sampling. And when I was coming up in the 90s, we were thinking about electronic music and hip hop as a sampling and collage-based medium. So what ended up happening is many groups like Tribe Called Quest, Public Enemy, sort of classic 90s groups were all making hip hop from old records. For me at least, I've been collecting records since I was a kid and was thinking about how would you make literature out of that. And basically, I've been collecting early Jamaican music for a long time. I used to go to Kingston, Jamaica a lot when I was a kid. And for example, I work with VP Records out of Kingston, Jamaica. And they're an old school Jamaican record label. And they gave me access to, for a recent album, to their record label's warehouse of old vinyl. Anybody who DJs, if you ever been to Jamaica, you know, it's just a little bit on the chaotic side. And basically, I got access to all the early 45 vinyl. And so that's one of the albums I did called Phantom Dance Hall. But it's all made from a collage of all of these kind of old records, but made into one record. So that's, you know, phonetics of graphology, phonograph, writing with sound. So what I've been doing today is remixing my talk. And like I said earlier, the book that I'm presenting here is called The Imaginary App. And everything I've been showing you is about graphic design as it becomes code and how code becomes things like this. Generally, the technical term is called skeuomorphic design, and it means if you're making something that looks like something else, but you're making a code. Say, for example, like Instagram has the little camera, or you have a telephone app, or you have messages app with a little icon, or something like that. Generally, this is now, we've moved away from that to what you call flat design, and that was something Apple really championed. So I'm going to just show one other example. This is an app I helped develop with the Smithsonian Museum that lets you pull apart a legendary African-American painter's work, Robert Bearden. He's a major figure. So they asked me to help think about DJing his paintings. So what you can do is you tap on the painting, and you can pull the painting apart and start making your own versions. And I'm just kind of doing this from pulling small bits and pieces. You can make them smaller, bigger, layer them, but you can then also share it as a high-resolution file, and you can send someone the remixed painting. So that's the idea, is DJing with painting, DJing with film, and so on. So, as I said earlier, yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the web, so I want to end my discussion with just a quick clip from the gentleman who invented the internet from 1969. His name's Leonard Kleinrock. And I tracked him down, and we got him to do a talk with me for a concert recently. So the internet has now shaped and molded almost all aspects of everything I'm talking about. Everyone in this room has a phone, and everyone in this room has a legacy of essentially what's going on with the sort of technologies of network systems based on that idea of being mobile. So let's just show you two quick things. And I think it's very important to give you a sense of how much data I'm talking about here. So, if you dial in really quickly, you can think of this. This is the first map of the first hubs of the internet. So in 1969, the internet as we know it today was just basically these two hubs, UCLA and Stanford Research Institute. So the first two hubs of the internet now have grown to an exponential level of billions and billions of nodes, and every phone in this room is part of that as well. So you got to imagine going from 1969 to 2019, that's an essential kind of complex system. And when you talk about complex systems, let's look at it 1 minute. This is just a year and a half ago, so I've been working the book for a while, my next book. So 60 seconds. In the 60 seconds I'm speaking, say for example, there's been over 400,000 tweets sent. For those of you millennials who are into this kind of thing, there's been 900,000 swipes on Tinder. 1.8 million Snapchats created. People have probably watched over 70,000 hours of Netflix. And then, you know, Amazon, for example, is making, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars every couple of seconds as well. YouTube, there's generally about 4 to 5 million views on videos. And generally there's over 300,000 apps being downloaded. And this is just a year and some change ago. So you got to imagine that's old, and if you start to update that and just pass, you know, 2019, you can imagine the sheer volume of data flying around. So one thing that I think is important as I wrap up is to give everyone a sense of how much data is going on. So if you just took an estimate, again, this is a little bit old, but there was over 100 billion apps downloaded, and that's in 2013. But 2017, that number would probably be about 300 billion apps downloaded in that year. Whereas just between 1962 to 2012, there was over 70 billion books bought. So there's more apps in 1 year than all books in the history of human kind. So just think about that, like one book as a physical, thing that's can be read, the legacy of Gutenberg versus the legacy of apps. So that's what my book was about, that sort of paradox, that new kind of literacy, and above all, that sense of play, because that means everyone in this room has a different kind of literacy, and everyone who has access to these kind of cell phones or apps can easily become an artist or a creative. And I think that's something, if there's a takeaway from today, I'd love for everyone to kind of keep that in mind. So let me just play you a quick clip about the invention of the internet, which is different than the web. Like I said earlier, yesterday was the 30th anniversary of the web, and 2019 is the 50th anniversary of the internet. So let's track him down. Here we go.
We've just entered a historic site here at UCLA. This location is where the internet began, and it began that piece of equipment. That's the first piece of equipment ever put on the internet. It's what you call a router today. This was 1969. In October of 1969, we had this first switch here at UCLA, and by October, we had the second switch up at Stanford Research Institute. The experiment we wanted to perform was to send a message up to SRI. Now, what kind of a message should we send? A really good one, like Armstrong from the moon, he said, "A giant leap for mankind"? Or Samuel Morse, "What hath God wrought"? Or Alexander Graham Bell, "Come here, Watson, I need you"? Those guys were smart. They understood public relations and media. We were nerds. We didn't have a message prepared. All we wanted to do was log in from here to SRI. To do that, you have to type LOG. And that machine will type the INs. You ready to go? Type the L, you get the L, type the L. Type the O, you get the O, type the O. Type the G, you get the G. Crash. The SRI machine crashed. So, the first message ever on the internet, by accident, was low, as in lo and behold. We couldn't have asked for more prophetic, more powerful, more succinct message than that. So here we are years later, and this machine and that message launched what we now call the internet. This is Len Kleinrock at UCLA. Here we see the first router, first piece of equipment of the internet ever. Let's look inside. This machine is so ugly, it's beautiful. There it is, technology from 1969. This is the machine that launched the internet. So I'd like to welcome you tonight to DJ Spooky's Entertainment.
All right, so I tracked Len down. It was great to be able to work with him. And basically, he introduced my concert. We had a big concert celebrating the 50th anniversary of the internet. And so what I did was take all the data of how many nodes there are on the internet, which you can see all that, and then I had a string ensemble play a sort of series of equations that I was running through my software. And we also made a VR part of that as well, where I'm controlling the ensemble with a virtual reality kind of software. So when you see one of my concerts, some of them are very art-oriented. Like I said, this is like, I write classical music, so I was looking at composers like Bach or Wagner on one hand, but I was also thinking about loops and layers and with this idea of composing with landscape. But if the landscape is made from data, then you have access to that data because that's what we all use. So here we are in 2019, and most of us have a new kind of literacy, a different approach to what we think of as text. And if that text is digital, that means it's radically unstable and will always be changing. So that's what I'm hoping everyone's takeaway from that is, because it's about the imaginary app, the book I just wrote. Now, I'm going to wrap up with a conversation between Einstein and one of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore. These two met backstage at the Nobel Prize Awards after Einstein had just won the Nobel Prize, and he had been the first Indian to win the Nobel Prize for poetry. But he used mathematics in his poetry, sort of Sanskrit early mathematics, and Einstein and him became good friends. When Einstein was working on the general theory of relativity, he would, whenever he had like a writer's block and he was working on some equations, he would go out and play violin. He was a really big Mozart fan and Bach fan as well. So he would just play some riffs from Bach, and then he would go back to writing. So one day he has writer's block, and he calls up Rabindranath Tagore and says, "Hey, I got this writer's block. I can't seem to get past the idea of either negation of infinity." And so Rabindranath Tagore says, "Well, in India we invented zero. You Westerners just got zero with Fibonacci." So that's the 12th, 13th century. And so the Indians had zero for thousands of years. So these two ended up writing out a book out of that conversation called On the Nature of Reality. And so that inspired my book, The Imaginary App. And I just want to wrap up with just saying, there's a whole bunch of different approaches I could have done today, but I like the idea of giving you guys a little bit of a remix, because that's the way I think. Now, Einstein is not normally someone you would think of with DJ culture, but that's the point. It's a collage, it's a mashup. And the remix is something that says all is possible. So, with that said and done, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure being here, and I want to just kind of give everyone a sense of just saying, if you have any questions or comments, let's open it up. So, like Einstein would say, logic will get you from A to B, but the imagination will take you everywhere. So, thank you guys so much. So, do we have time for questions, or should we do? All right. Well, so if anybody has questions or comments, feel free. You got a mega mix today between art, code, and collage. And he's playing a video game. There we go. All right. So, anybody got any questions, comments? And, hey, how you doing?
You mentioned copyright tangentially. I wonder if you could just expand on what you think the benefits and the different limitations are of copyright for an artist, definitely an artist and master artist like you. And what do you see as like the future of copyright as a law?
That's a great. I'm glad you brought that up. Well, the project I did in Antarctica was basically a critique of copyright, because Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government. And so the whole pun was we made an album that we released open source online, where anyone could take the data that we had used to generate the material and make their own music. So we took different equations and put it into electronic music. And it's always better to just give people a quick example. So, for example, when I was working on that, I'll just show you really quick. I ended up having a singer sing the geometry of the ice, and I'll show you that. And it's always easier to kind of show a quick example. So here you're going to hear, let's see. And copyright applies to things where there's scarcity. But once something's digital, you have infinite amounts of copies of it. So for example, here's a woman singing this equation of the geometry of ice. And if I wanted to just do a permutation, and that's just the voice again. And that's no beat. I'm gonna add a beat. No beat at all. And no beat. So if I wanted to be able to take beats apart, you can sample, start looping, and make your own remix to the point where it's unrecognizable. So when I got back from Antarctica, I had all this data from climate scientists, and so that music was all derived from equations and the different kinds of electronic music that would kind of come out of those equations. So who would own that? That was the point. It was meant to be a provocation. But we also worked with the Sci-Fi Channel, and I just want to show you this really quickly because to me, data is a commons. It's some place where people, the better the data is, the more we exchange it, the more you can interrogate and make sure that you have more robust and better information. So I'll just show you this really quickly.
Let's imagine the things you see every day in nature actually contain secret sounds. DJ Spooky went to Antarctica, and where others heard silence, he heard music. He took the visual patterns of the mountain continent and created a living symphony. You've heard that the environment is changing, but you've never heard it like this. DJ Spooky imagined greater.
Your turn.
Go to let'simagingreater.com.
So we made a whole bunch of open source initiatives about climate data, and so because we were working with Sci-Fi Channel, They would put it between like Battlestar Galactica or like, you know, crazy. So kids would be watching like some science fiction movie, and then all of a sudden it would turn to like a climate thing, and you'd have like breakdancing penguins or something. But again, the idea is that because Antarctica and one could argue we're in the middle of a huge climate crisis, and it's hard to argue with a storm that just smashed your house. I think it's really important to say that copyright is meant for when there's physical objects, and that's a different era. We really need to update our thoughts about who owns ideas. So I'm a big fan of saying anybody can sample anything, and I've worked with Library of Congress as well. There's a film I produced on the history of African American cinema with Library of Congress. I'll just show you that really quickly. Everything I'm talking about, by the way, if you're interested, you can go by the website. It's djspooky.com, and feel free to remix. I promise I won't sue anybody. But we did a 5 DVD box set with the Library of Congress based on early work that was not that hasn't been available for a while because it was a lot of the first films made by black directors you couldn't find anymore. And I also worked on this project where I remixed D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, which is generally considered to be a very racist, sort of heavy film. It's like a KKK film, and like it's totally wild. But I DJ'd and remixed the film again because it's from 1915. There's a copyright; it's open because of the copyright closure laws. So with that said and done, you know, I had Kronos Quartet, which is a legendary string ensemble, play that. And again, because it's 1915, we made the film elements available for anyone to remix. I'm a big fan of saying that if you put your work out in the world, everybody's going to run with it. You can't police that. And I'm on SoundCloud, Spotify, pretty much every major platform. And there's no way I would ever, you know, I just put the work out. So that I need to update, or other artists need to update their business model. Like a lot of normal hip hop musicians or people who are really popular on YouTube will monetize their channel. And that's an interesting way. For me, I do my business models based on concerts and events. So there's different approaches. But anybody else have any questions, comments? Mm-hmm.
So when you say you remix Birth of a Nation, like you like made it into music or like you just remix?
Thank you for the question. She was saying when I remixed a film, did I make it into music or did I just, so we re-edited the whole film. And we had, the early film is 3 hours long. And we got, I can be sort of persuasive, we got the Greek government to give me the Acropolis for an evening. And so we had these cranes and we projected the film around and this is a little hip hop moment, you know. So this is the Herod Atticus Theater at the base of the Acropolis. And it holds about 5,000 people. We did a huge sound system throughout the ruins. And we had about 5,000 people come to the show. And it's, you know, it's a beautiful night in Athens. And I was like, hey everybody, thanks for coming to the show. I think I'm the first DJ player in like a couple thousand years. So this also went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So when you know, what I'm saying is like the idea is DJ as director. And you can, like with electronic music, many of my peers, people like DJ Crush, DJ Shadow, Cut Chemist, Z-Trip, and then more popular pop people like Moby or something like that. Everyone uses electronic music where you have small voices, it's bits and pieces. And a lot of the music's instrumental. So you can actually rescore early silent film very easily. And Birth of a Nation is particularly a very toxic and twisted film with a very long history. And I wanted to kind of turn the film upside down on its head. So getting Kronos Quartet, they're one of America's premier string ensembles. To have them play with hip hop and then kind of remix it, because the original score for that film was based on Wagner. And D.W. Griffith and then influenced many other filmmakers like John Ford or even Francis Ford Coppola. I don't know if anybody ever saw Apocalypse Now, where there's a very famous scene where they play Wagner when they're about to start bombing these Vietnamese villages. That's from a remix of a scene from Birth of a Nation where it's called Bride of the Klansman. And I'll just play that really quickly just to give you a sense of remix. And I think it's really fascinating just to see how different. Here we go. So this is the original soundtrack. Which everyone knows is Flight of the Valkyrie. It's very famous, Wagner. But that's a riff that everybody knows. So with DJing, you play with riffs in the same way. Like you can sample it, remix it, and so on. So I kind of chuckle about that just from the viewpoint of sampling and hip hop and so on. So when I remixed it, you know, it's let's see if do I have, this is kind of a fun one. So I could be doing scratch routines or stuff like that over it live and mix it with hip hop beats and, you know, start doing it. You guys, like I said, you guys are, we're at a university, but normally I'd be at a party, be like lasers and people. You know, the party's jumping, that kind of thing's happening. So this is a very artsy, you guys are doing art. So yeah, that's a remix, you know, but that's, you take one thing that everybody knows and you flip it around. So anybody else?
What did you study in college to get to this point?
Okay, the question is, what did I study in college? I studied, I did 2 degrees, one in philosophy, the other in French literature. This is my family, this is 1972, I was born in 1970. My dad was dean of Howard University Law School, and my mom was a historian of design, so I kind of grew up with both parents sort of being professors. And you know, so I majored in philosophy and did a senior honors thesis on Ludwig Feuerbach, which probably none of you guys have ever heard of. One person, all right. Totally useless degree. But when I graduated, I was DJing as a side hustle. And on campus, much like you guys are at university, I would throw a party every once in a while because there was fraternities at both. And I hated the music they were playing. They were always playing like some pop stuff. And I got really frustrated with that. And would start throwing my own party on campus. We took over with like a campus room on a Friday night. We charged $5 at the door, and I would make, you know, a couple $100, maybe $2,000 on a Friday night as a freshman. So that I was like, I don't have to do a 9 to 5. So I mean, you realize you're making a little more money from the DJing than from philosophy. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, college. I mean, so thank you for that. Maybe one more question or? All right, well, with that said, everything I'm talking about is from my website, so please feel free to drop a line on Twitter. It's at DJ Spooky, Facebook, all that stuff. And thank you for coming out.